While today's vehicles certainly have a lot of technology in them, there's often few features that you can really show off to your friends or ones that are overly quirky. Most cars today just have that solidified black lava interior that's relatively drab and some oversized iPad-looking thing as a touchscreen on the interior. And because everybody drives a crossover mostly these days or a pickup, a lot of the vehicles just simply look the same because you can't do too much with the proportions and overall styling as compared to the more typical vehicles of yesteryear, where you had a bit more ability to provide interesting surfacing as well as styling. In this video, we're going to explore the top 10 inventions of vintage vehicles. And this is obviously a subjective list, and if you feel that I've missed something, which I probably have because it's hard to construct a top 10 list, put it in the comments section. But these are at least some of my favorite cool, wacky inventions that were installed on cars, and certainly some of the most memorable in my mind. Let's start out with number 10, and that is these paisley or mod tops that were put a number of vehicles in the late 60s and early 1970s. Now, these tops, I don't know who came up with the idea or thought that this was a good idea, but they seem to be most prevalent on Chrysler Corporation cars during that time period. And here you can see an ad for the 1969 Barracuda, and Chrysler calls it a pop print or a mod top. I don't know, I just kind of call this one a floral pattern. But there was also paisley patterns and different strange designs that, in particular, Chrysler put on their vehicles in the late 60s and early 1970s. Witness this particular paisley-like pattern on a Plymouth Fury Grand Coupe, and boy, is that ever funky. I don't know if I could drive around in a car that had a top like this, but for whatever reason, somebody at Chrysler thought, let's just put this pattern on tops so that, as the previous ad said, you can wear basically your car. Now, perhaps the strangest application of one of these mod tops or paisley tops was one that was completely unintentional and that found itself only on 1971 Imperials, where a buyer had selected the burgundy vinyl roof. You can see here that the roof has this floral pattern to it, but this was not how the vehicle started its life. What happened was that after a number of car washes and time in the sunlight, what was once an apparently burgundy and solid colored top with no floral pattern devolved into what you see here. It was a defect in the material. Some speculated that Chrysler had some old vinyl material that was laying around and dyed it burgundy to try to offer that burgundy top option. And then after car washes and some sunlight exposure, it faded to this particular, awful vinyl roof. And Chrysler ended up recalling all of these and installing new vinyl roofs for their owners in a different color because they didn't offer a replacement burgundy vinyl. So while the overall, I'll say, inspiration for the tops was kind of cool and funky, I think the most humorous application of one of these mod tops or floral print tops was actually this unintentional one that found its way onto the 1971 Imperial, at least after you own the car for a brief bit. Let's move on to number 9. And at number 9, we have GM's manual clamshell tailgate for the 1971 to 76 model years. In 1971, General Motors full-size cars were all new, and that also meant that the wagons were all new in 1971. And for that particular year, GM introduced a novel design, the so-called clamshell tailgate that you see here, although this is not a 1971 vehicle that's pictured. In any case, the upper portion there, the glass, actually retracts into the roof, and then the tailgate would drop underneath the bumper, revealing a completely flat load floor. It seemed at first like it was a better idea versus Ford's dual-action tailgate, for instance, where you could either swing the door out, which required a lot of room behind the vehicle, or drop it down like a tailgate. And frankly, that probably was a better solution from Ford. But in any event, GM was trying to do something different, and they thought this clamshell was more innovative because you really didn't have to worry about needing space to swing that door open in tailgate form or dropping it down. You could just raise the glass and lower the lower portion of the tailgate, and everything was out of the way. Now, one of the things that's super cool and kind of quirky about these clamshell tailgates is that most people know they had the power-operated glass. So no matter what clamshell wagon you had, the glass was always power-operated as it would retract into the roof. But a little-known tidbit that most people don't know is that you could get both a manual tailgate as well as a power tailgate on these clamshell wagons. Had to pay extra for the power on most of them. And here's how you can tell which one a particular vehicle has. Notice here on this clamshell wagon that around that lock cylinder on the passenger side, there are 2 tabs above and beneath it. This is the manual clamshell tailgate. And another way that you can tell is see the little handle there in the middle of the tailgate? That's to help you pick it up. This tailgate was actually counterbalanced, so you'd first have to raise the glass, and then once you raise the glass, you could turn that locking tab, and it would drop the tailgate down. It was counterbalanced, so it wouldn't really drop down all the way. You'd kind of have to push it down a little bit to lock into position. And then when you would turn those tabs around the lock cylinder again, it would release and it would pop up a little bit, but you'd have to pick it up and raise it the full way. Now, one of the interesting things was that GM made that little twist thing around the lock cylinder inoperable unless the glass was raised, I believe, at least 6 or 8 inches. So you couldn't just drop the tailgate unless the glass had been raised, nor could you actually release it from its lowered position. So that was pretty smart. You didn't get your fingers pinched, but that was a safety feature that GM had on these manual tailgates. I just think it's humorous that on a wagon that you could get either a power or manual tailgate, but the window was always power on all of these clamshell wagons. In any case, the clamshell is one of those iconic motor vehicles, certainly of the 1970s, and many people have memories riding around in them. I do think one good thing that GM did on these is that as opposed to having the rear-facing rear seat, the rear seat in these faces forward. And I actually prefer that. I don't know about anybody else, but I tend to get motion sickness sitting in the back of these wagons if I'm facing rearward. So I do think that that was one advantage of these clamshells over some of the other wagons, although Fords, you sat looking at one another as opposed to forward or back. And well, that was an interesting design, too, that some people liked. Let's go on to number 8. And at number 8, we have Ford's so-called gold glass that was found, in particular in the Thunderbirds in the 1970s. Now, the Thunderbird, by this point, had become quite the porker. What had once started out as a vehicle that was a 2-place sporty vehicle had now evolved into the so-called Big Bird of the 1970s. And the biggest Thunderbird of all was this Thunderbird that was introduced for the 1973 model year. Here, this is a 1974 model pictured. But these Thunderbirds were absolutely huge and made even more huge by the supersized bumper that you can see there. Both front and rear for the 1974 model year owed to impact standards that all auto companies had to meet. Now, despite the fact that this was a relatively large vehicle in terms of its overall size, the passenger compartment wasn't that big. And in fact, the rear windows, which did retract into the sail panel, couldn't even retract all the way, whether they were on opera window cars or non-opera window cars, despite the fact that the car was absolutely huge. But these Thunderbirds did offer a super novel option for the time, and one that would come back for a little bit on vehicles in the 80s and 90s and then just disappear altogether. And that was the so-called gold glass option that helped defrost the windshield as well as the rear window. And here's a picture from the 1974 Thunderbird brochure describing the option. Take a look there at the caption underneath the girl who's looking out the rear window, and it says, "Quick defrost windshield rear window. New gold film laminated in glass quickly helps melt snow and ice." And of course, you could get the electric rear window de-icer as well, which is pretty common on most cars, but really nobody else at this point had that gold film that would help instantly de-ice the windshield as well as the rear window. Again, this was something that, during the time, as is the case today, if you had ice on your windshield, you basically had to wait for the car to warm up and defrost it with the normal hot air outlets unless you exercised your muscles and got out your window scraper. So it was a pretty cool and novel option. And one of the things that's not mentioned here, but when you did upgrade to this option, you actually got 2 alternators on the car. Apparently it would draw so much current that one alternator wasn't enough. So these cars that have this option have 2 alternators, and if you ever see a Thunderbird that has 2 alternators, you know it's got the gold glass. I suspect that the option was sunset in part because people didn't like the gold glass and the tint that it gave the windshield, but perhaps also because the replacement cost, at least from an insurance perspective, must have been astronomically high. So in any event, it was sunset after a few years, and like I said, some auto companies brought it back. Even Cadillac in the early 90s had the electric de-icing on the windshields, but never really saw it again after that period for whatever reason. I think it's a good idea. I guess automakers just thought that they could get the windshields to defrost fast enough as is. Let's move on to number 7, and that is the dealer-installed dictation option in Chrysler vehicles of the late 60s and early 70s. Here you see depicted a 1972 Imperial, one of, at least in my opinion, the most handsome full-size Chryslers, or the C-bodies, of the era. These vehicles had fuselage-style styling, as Chrysler called it, that denoted their clean body sides, and I think they're just some of the most handsome Chrysler vehicles ever produced. Unfortunately, as is the case sometimes with well-styled Chrysler vehicles, like the 1957 models, these cars, well, some of the engineering left a little bit to be desired, but I should say maybe not even the engineering, but the build quality. In any case, they were really attractive vehicles, and they did have good engines and transmissions and other features. And one of those features, if you take a look at this picture from a 1972 Imperial brochure, was this dealer-installed dictation option. This basically rested on the transmission tunnel in the floor, and you got a microphone with it, and of course you could put a tape in and then dictate whatever you needed to your secretary, and presumably it would then be transcribed into whatever memo you were looking to issue. I don't believe that such a dictation option was offered by any of the other big three, or AMC, I guess, should include in that as well. But here in the Chryslers, I thought it was a pretty novel option and perhaps handy for some, although I don't know how effective it would be, particularly if you were dictating while driving. That doesn't sound like it's a great thought. But Chrysler offered this option for a number of years, and I suppose it proved handy for some of those who really needed it. Let's move on to number 6. And at number 6, we have the continuously variable wipers offered by Ford on its Thunderbird and Lincoln Mark III. Now, beginning in 1958, I believe, Ford started offering hydraulically operated wipers on its Thunderbird, and this offered a number of advantages. First, remember, by this point in time, many cars still had vacuum-operated wipers, so when you'd step on the accelerator pedal and the engine lost vacuum, just as you needed to see the windshield more as you were passing someone, for instance, the windshield wipers would basically stop or kind of start moving very slowly. And so in 1958, Ford introduced this new, I believe it was engineered not by Ford, but by Trico, Hydro Wipe wipers, as they were called. And it was a good setup. It was powered off of the power steering pump, and the power steering pump would effectively pressurize this motor that would operate the wipers. And the cool thing about it is that this is before the days of the delay feature on wipers, where you'd have a time delay before they would wipe again. So this setup actually enabled drivers to continuously vary the wiper speed. So you could have the wipers wipe very slowly, or you could have them wipe relatively quickly. So they didn't cycle on and off on a time delay interval, but they just wiped more slowly or quickly depending upon what you so desired. And this feature, when the Mark III was introduced in 1969, made it over to the Mark III for the 69, 70, and 71 model years. And then for 1972, the Thunderbird and the Mark IV then had just kind of the standard electric wipers. But again, a super cool setup, an interesting idea, although I don't know if I'd want the wiper wiping very slowly right in the middle of my field of vision. And I suspect that's the reason why it was eventually just kind of sunset in favor of the delay wipers. But another cool tidbit about these is that you can actually activate the wipers with the car off. If you have the car off and then you open the wiper, I guess I'll call it a switch. It's really a dial that's opening an orifice in this particular setup so that it can basically determine how fast the windshield wipers wipe. In any event, if you open that orifice and then you turn the steering wheel back and forth with the car off, the wipers will actually start operating. So Interesting quirk of this particular option. It's a good idea. It was in production for a number of years, 1958 to 1971, and I think customers generally liked it. Let's move on to the next one. At number 5, we have the 1960 to 1961 Corvair gas heater. Chevrolet introduced the Corvair for the 1960 model year, and you can kind of think about it as a supersized VW. It's got an air-cooled flat six-cylinder engine in the rear, kind of similar to the VW engine, although that was not a flat six. And it just was a novel car for the time period. It also had somewhat quirky styling, as you can see here, but it was a charming car overall, and it certainly sold well, especially in its early years. Unfortunately, as time would go on and a book would be written about its handling abilities or lack thereof by Ralph Nader, the car's popularity would eventually wane. But in the 1960 and 61 model years, Chevrolet offered a Corvair gas heater. Yes, I said that right, a gas heater that was actually powered by the gasoline in the tank in order to help, let's say, get your cabin in your Corvair warm on cold winter days. The normal heater on these, similar to VW's, simply took air that was blown over the engine and would then basically blow it into the cabin to give you a little bit extra heat. But if you wanted something more than that, you could opt for this optional gas heater that used that gasoline in the tank to effectively heat up a heat exchanger, which would then provide supplemental heat into the cabin. And here's a page from the Corvair brochure describing this particular setup. You see it says, heater and defroster for your comfort. No longer waiting for the engine to warm up the heater, gives almost instant heat when the switch is turned on. The fuel for operating the heater is taken from the gasoline tank of the car. Gasoline consumption to operate the heater is a very small amount per hour. The amount of heat desired can be controlled by a temperature control knob, a highly efficient operating heater and defroster. Well, it may have been efficient, but it also was, as you can imagine, dangerous. And after a few model years, as I mentioned, this was no longer an option for your Corvair. But super quirky. You can see there that the fuel pump would basically be pumping fuel not only to the carburetor, but through a pressure regulator, which would then go to this gasoline heater. And I guess it was a good idea, but certainly has some safety concerns, although the vehicle overall was, let's say, pigeonholed for its overall safety. But that was principally due to the rear suspension setup, which, by the way, wasn't all that different from other cars of the era. I think in some ways the Corvair was unfairly picked on. But this gas heater is one of those quirky features that certainly is an interesting one. I don't think I've ever seen that on a General Motors car ever since. Perhaps there were some of these in the very early vehicles closer to the turn of the 20th century. But by this point in time, this was really the only GM car that was using it, really because this was the only GM car with an air-cooled engine. I do love, by the way, how this heater employed an automotive-style coil and spark plug to get it going. You can see those on the top left there, too. So it really was an automotive gas heater. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have the 1960 to 1961 Buick so-called Mirr speedometer. In 1960, Buick vehicles were in their final year, at least the full-size vehicles were in their final year. And I think that there was an overall handsome design, although it looked a little bit pudgier than the 59s. The 60 Buick really has some interesting exterior sculpture and styling. But on the interiors on these vehicles were also equally beautiful as the exterior. And take a look here at this shot of a 1960 Buick instrument cluster. And one of the things that you'll notice in this instrument cluster is what appears to be kind of a typical speedometer, but this is far from the typical speedometer that you're used to. More specifically, what you're looking at is actually a mirror reflection of a speedometer that is laying down inside that dash. Let's take a look here at a picture of this speedometer in more detail. Here's a picture of some speedometer clusters from Buicks of this era, and let's just take a look at the bottom one. They're both the same, but in the bottom one, you'll notice that the speedometer is actually printed as a mirror image, and that's because this is the real speedometer on these vehicles, and then there's a piece of mirror glass that basically reflects the speedometer so that the driver can see it. The advantage of this was that the driver could tilt the mirror up or down, and so if you were a different height than, say, another driver, you could easily adjust the speedometer so that it was quite legible. But the strange part about it is that in order to get the mirror image to look correctly, Buick actually had to print the speedometer as the inverse image, as you see here. This was also a rotating drum speedometer, one of my favorite style speedometers, that a drum would rotate and a line would basically appear as you sped up. Now, as I mentioned, this was offered in Buicks only for the 1960 and 61 model years. It's interesting that the feature crossed over Buick's introduction of all new full-size cars in 1961 that wore completely different exterior sheet metal. And even the interior of the 1961 Buick that you see here is totally different from the 1960 Buick, except for that super cool speedometer. I guess Buick customers liked it, or at least Buick thought customers liked it, and they kept it around for that extra model year before it was sunset in favor of just the typical horizontal speedometer in the 1962 model year. But for 1960 and 61, if you got a Buick, you got this super cool mirrored speedometer. Let's move on to number 3, and at number 3 we have the 67 to 68 Imperial Mobile Director option. Now, we previously talked about being able to get a dictation microphone in your Imperial, but this is a far cooler option and was only offered for 2 model years, 1967 and 68. In 1967, Chrysler's Imperial would be a new design, and it was no longer riding atop a full frame. It was now a unibody vehicle, and it was starting to increasingly become a, let's call it, glamorized Chrysler, as opposed to a separate and true Imperial. In any case, for the 1967 and 68 model years, and interestingly only on coupes, a buyer could opt for the so-called Mobile Director option that you see here. The option included this trick front seat that could swivel around and a console that could fold out into a table, as well as a separate lamp for the table. Now, it's quite interesting that Chrysler would offer this option just on the coupes. You would think that, if anything, you'd offer such an option on the four-doors. But the problem was that you couldn't get the rotating seat with a four-door car because the mechanism would interfere with the B-pillar. Thus, you were forced into getting the two-door coupe if you wanted the Mobile Director option. And as a result, it really wasn't popular at all. I think somewhere around 100 ended up being sold, and they're super rare today. I also don't know what you could really do. This is before cell phones, so you really could just basically use your typewriter or take notes or something. You weren't going to be able to talk to anybody because there was no phone in the car. So I suspect that people really just didn't quite understand the purpose, and I think that the dictation microphone ended up being probably a better option because you could just sit in your car and speak as opposed to having to type. And let's face it, at this point in time, very few executives actually even knew how to type. That's what they had administrative staff for. So, in any case, very few were sold. It was a cool idea. I wonder if it would actually sell today. I might pay some money for something like this in a modern car, but to my knowledge, nobody really offers it. But Chrysler certainly did in 1967 and 1968. Let's move on to number 2. And at number 2, we have a few half V8 four-cylinder engines introduced by Pontiac as well as International Harvester. In 1961, Pontiac introduced its Tempest, a so-called senior compact that was introduced alongside the Oldsmobile F85 and Buick Skylark. But the Tempest was the only one of these vehicles that was powered by a Pontiac-specific engine, and that was its so-called Trophy 4, the 195 cubic inch, half of a 389 cubic inch V8. Now, what makes this four-cylinder so strange and unique and weird is that it literally was half of a V8 engine in large part. You can see that the passenger side cylinder bank is the one that's there. The driver's side cylinder bank is missing, and so it's consequently leaned over at 45 degrees. And the space that is missing there on the driver's side, because there's no cylinder bank there, effectively is where the starter is placed and the generator and some other accessories. But this was really an ingenious design. Remember that the senior compacts from Olds and Buick came standard with a very expensive aluminum block, 215 cubic inch V8. And here Pontiac was able to produce a cast iron, reliable, by and large, four-cylinder engine that really was cheap to build. They could run this down the same tooling as the V8s. And in fact, they did exactly that, and they would alternate running the cylinder blocks down alternate banks of the V8 machining line so they didn't just wear out the tools on one side. They would effectively, I think part of the week they would run on one side of the line, the other week, part of the week they would run on the other side of the line. The Trophy 4, I guess, worked somewhat well. As you can imagine, when you have a four-cylinder engine that's 195 cubic inches without a balance shaft, the main gripe about it was that it shook quite a bit at idle. And the other gripe I would say about it is that aside from the idle quality, while it did have some reliability issues, mostly timing chain issues that owed to the vibration of the engine. These would tend to throw timing chains, in some cases, after 20,000 miles, 30,000 miles. They would just really get stretched out from the vibrations of the four-cylinder engine and then jump time. So that was really the other Achilles heel of this engine. But aside from that, if you put a new and modern timing set in these, they do prove to be pretty reliable engines, and there even were some peppy four-cylinder versions of the Trophy 4, including ones with a four-barrel carburetor. So how cool is that? Now, over at International Harvester, a similar technique was employed by them actually at the same time. When the Scout was introduced in 1961, it came standard with a half an International Harvester 304 V8, 152 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, the so-called Comanche four-cylinder engine. And four cylinders would be the standard engines in Scouts all the way through the 1980 model year when they were sunset. The 152 even came in turbocharged form, and then in 1968, International Harvester released a larger four-cylinder engine that displaced 196 cubic inches. So there were a few of these four cylinders that were floating around between International Harvester and Pontiac. The International Harvesters had a good reputation for reliability. Again, they were somewhat crude, but I would say that overall, the individuals who had these in their Scouts were generally happy so long as they really weren't trying to accelerate hard or lived in hilly country. They just didn't make very much horsepower. Even the turbocharged 152 cubic inch Ford just made 111 horsepower. So nothing all that great. In any case, these half of V8 engines are pretty sweet and interesting designs, and certainly some of the strangest inventions in automotive history. Let's move on to number one, and that is the 1961 to 63 Pontiac Tempest rope drive shaft and transaxle. Now, we just talked about the Tempest, you say, with the four-cylinder engine. Well, yes, the Tempest had so many strange and quirky features that it actually garners number one and number two on this list. And as I said, number one is really this rope drive shaft setup, as it was known, and the rear-mounted transaxle. So let's start with the transaxle. This is something that I won't say is common, but is more common certainly now than it was in 1961 when the Tempest introduced it. You'll see in Corvettes for a number of years, they've had the transmission mounted in the rear really for weight distribution, and they've had this rear transaxle setup. But in 1961, this was really unheard of, particularly on domestic vehicles. And the Tempest introduced it for General Motors. It's the Tempest-matic transmission is out back there as opposed to being coupled directly behind the engine. And the interesting thing about the transaxle is that the torque converter on these is actually exposed. If you look under the car while it's running, you can see the torque converter spinning, which is just bizarre. You don't see that on any conventional vehicles because the torque converter is really encased within the transmission housing. The Tempest-matic was an okay transmission. It really wasn't overly reliable, I would say. But the other cool piece about this is the flexible drive shaft that was engineered to really help quell the engine vibration. So that's what the engine attached to basically this drive shaft, which would then be attached to the rear transaxle. Now, because of that, the drive shaft on these is really thin. When you think of a drive shaft, you often think of a very thick drive shaft that's, let's say, 2-3 inches in diameter. But this rope drive shaft is super small, and that's because it doesn't have to take the torque that's multiplied by the automatic transmission and transmit that torque to the rear wheels. Here's a picture of the torque tube as well as the drive shaft from one of these Tempests. Notice the torque tube is relatively large, but there's the drive shaft, that spindly little thing. That's all it is. On the automatic transmission cars, it was 0.65 inches in diameter. On the manual transmission cars, it was 3/4 of an inch in diameter, and it was about 90-ish inches long. So it's a pretty spindly piece of nickel chrome moly alloy, but I guess in general it worked. So this is just a super strange and unique design. It allegedly helped quell some of the vibrations from the four-cylinder. It also gave the vehicle a flatter floor because the flexible drive shaft meant that it didn't have to have as large of a hump. So interesting setup, and that's why it's at the top of the list. Hope you enjoyed this spotlight on all of these interesting innovations. If I missed one, put it in the comment section. And please like, comment, and subscribe. That helps the algorithm. And until next time, take care.